we've got about 50 minutes, and that should be more than enough. James, I don't know if you'd like to go out and round a few of them up in a couple of minutes. I'd like to talk about George Orwell. He was one of the major writers of the 20th century. Many people believe that this political novel, 1984, is in many respects the novel of the 20th century. It is probable that by the middle of this era, the middle of this century, at the beginning of the new millennium, this novel will be seen as axiomatic of much that went on in the era just before. Orwell was dying when he wrote this work, and he wrote it on the island of Jura. He wrote it in a tent. He wrote it in an island that had been rented to him by the proprietor of a magazine called the Adelphi. He was dying. Could you close the door at the back, please? He was dying when it was written, but it doesn't really bear upon it the impress of a dying man. 1984 has entered into the language of contemporary modernity. Even the word totalitarianism was made fashionable by it. The term Big Brother, the belief in an all-powerful and all-seeing yet strangely unknown party, the notion of newspeak, the notion of INSOC or English socialism, the extraordinarily famous broadcast in the middle of the 1950s, which caused a scandal at the time when the BBC broadcast it, with the late Peter Cushing playing Winston Smith in the title role. It is said that one Tory MP got up in the House of Commons and condemned the BBC for having this broadcast because one of his constituents had dropped dead during the middle of it. The ultimate critical accolade, dropping dead in the middle of a TV performance. It is quite possible that she dropped dead at the moment when the rats are introduced into the mask to torture Winston at the end by the party. If you remember O'Brien, who is the sort of sadistic party priest and has an Irish Catholic name, of course, because there's an anti-Catholic element to the novel, and Blair, or Orwell, was a Scottish Protestant in many respects. That strand is there. And she dropped dead at the moment when the rats are introduced. Do you remember the moment in the cellars of the Ministry of Love? When O'Brien says to Winston about the one thing that every individual fears above all, and he knows that in Winston's case it's rats, and rats are introduced into this mask. Richard Burton, of course, played O'Brien in the famous Virgin film, actually, done by Branson's organisation, of 1984. In 1984, Burton was dying of cancer at the time, and it was not just his last great performance, but his last performance. Now, this novel begins with a very famous quote. I don't usually actually quote in my talks, but I think this is one occasion when I'll differ from that. This is a triadic novel, in accordance with the Dantean schema which prevails in a lot of Western literature. You have a tripartite division. The affair between him and Julia, the party dissident, is in some ways a slightly squalid version of heaven. The purgatorial existence under the rule of the all-seeing party in the first part of the volume is purgatory, and the last sequence in the always lit, electronically lit cellars of the Ministry of Love is hell, under the dispensation of O'Brien and the totalitarian party that he serves. The novel begins in this way. 1984, Part 1. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions. Notice. They're not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with them. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a coloured poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a metre wide, the face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for hate week. Yeah. The flat was 7 flights up. And Winston, he was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed down from the wall. It was one of those posters which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you. The caption beneath it ran. Now, of course, that's a portrait in cartoon-like way of Joseph Stalin. Yeah. Who, if you remember, had the handlebar moustache and the eyes that seemed to follow you around the room in a sort of a quasi-Elizabethan painting where the eyes are hollowed out and a spy watches you in between one room and another, and so on. On a personal touch, my mother's stepfather had a portrait of Joseph Stalin on his wall in the pantry because he was communist shop steward in the Avro's works that built the Lancaster bomber in Manchester. And so Stalin gazed down upon the buses and upon the Eccles cake and upon the things in that Manchester pantry. Stalin, his hero. Although he once said that it wasn't Stalin, it would be Hitler. Because he was one of these individuals who'd never be in the middle, you see, because he was naturally of an illiberal mind. But there we are. Don't forget, these individual leaders had enormous cults. Earlier in the 20th century, the post-modern people wandering around with their shopping bags this afternoon in central London are living in a totally different time and in a totally different temperature and moral climate. Now, the novel begins with a lot of sense data, which shows that Orwell was a novelist and not a political ideologue. One of the reasons that this novel has lasted is because it is not political philosophy translated into novelistic effect. It's a novel infused with political ideas. What most apolitical people remember is the cabbage smell that's everywhere, the dirty maps that are everywhere. Whenever you put your hand on something, there's dust and there's dirt. Everything's decrepit and broken down, and yet the tunnel in the background's pumping out ideology about the glory of socialism and the coming struggle of the masses. You know? The one thing that's forgotten about this novel is that this novel is a comedy. It's actually an extraordinarily funny book, and Orwell views it in deeply dark, satirical terms. The fact that the world is not read it as a comedy, but has actually read it literally as a fact, is a testament partly to the extraordinary, cynical and dark and truthfully nature of Orwell's outlook. Maybe it was also affected by the fact that he was dying at the time that he wrote it. This novel is a satire on many of the leftist Hampstead intellectuals that Orwell knew in the 30s and the 40s. Robert Conquest, who wrote The Great Hunger and The Great Terror about Stalin's atrocities in the Soviet Union, was angered to do so by the mealy-mouthed and appeasing apologetics which he came across in the salons of Hampstead and elsewhere, and Orwell was very similar. Orwell was a paradoxical man, a socialist of upper-middle-class origins who was in revolt against the empire of his day and wrote a book called Bernie's Days, which was a testament to that revolt. Yet also a man who in some respects was a Tory, in inverted commas, was archaic, in leftist terms, was of a bit of a nationalist, and a man who always adored rubbing the fur of his own side backwards. Orwell was one of these people who was an extraordinarily difficult bedfellow, as his fellow leftists were to discover. He made his name, amongst other things, for editing an R.M. Evans Review Tribune on the left of the Labour Party in the 1930s. But his hostility to Stalinism and to left totalitarianism, his hostility to the British Communist Party, and his hostility to the tactics communists used to impose their discipline on others, became apparent throughout the 1930s and 40s. They were basically crystallised by his experience in the Spanish Civil War, where, typical of Orwell, he didn't go for any of the left militias that were most favoured, and ended up with the POUM, which was in the command of somebody called Nin, I think. He was a minor Demi-Trotskyist figure, despised by the anarchists and by the official left, and yet to one side of the main socialist bloc fighting in the Republican cause. This is rather typical of Orwell, because you know full well that he's aligned himself with a faction that, if crushed in internal left disputes, will mean that he's actually persecuted by his own side. And this is, of course, what happened. So when the July days in Madrid, when the anarchists and the communists fought with each other inside the Republican zone, when there needed to be a scapegoat for that fighting, they turned on this tiny little party that everyone hated, called the POUM. And they became fascist apologists. clerical dog collarists, running dogs of the international bourgeois conspiracy, and so on. And these individuals were hunted down with extreme ruthlessness, and all those that were found were shot and killed without any sort of a tribunal or a trial at all. The leader of this particular sect was tortured to death by the communist secret police inside the Republican zone. These incidents traumatised Orwell and made him a sort of critical figure of parts of the left on the left. We look back today through rose-tinted spectacles to a degree. When he wrote this sort of material, the world was still very much in the balance, and the forces against which he was inveighing in part, novelistically, could well have come to power. It's also interesting to note that most of Orwell's books are not forgotten today, but would have been partly forgotten had he not written The Fable Animal Farm about the Bolshevik coup, and had he not written 1984 about the texture and nature and what novelists call sense data of living under a totalitarian left dictatorship. One of the interesting things to note is that Eastern European intellectuals, particularly in societies like Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere, all regarded this book as essentially a factual commentary on their lives. So close was it an imaginary and yet projected identification with what it was like to live under Ceausescu's Romania, for example. There are also extraordinary parallels between reality and this novel, which, don't forget, was written in 1948, which is why when he needed a title he inverted it and it became 1984. Now, in Ceausescu's Romania, almost every telephone conversation was listened to. And if you ran to the country out from the outside, the Securitate, the all-pervasive secret police, would break the line, very crude, pre-digital connections, and they would put in a new block of tape to listen to the message again. And you had to ring again, and then you had to ring again, and they would block the line, and you had to ring again, and so on. Because everything was being listened to, even when it wasn't. Every cafe table had a microphone underneath it, but 80% of them didn't work. But people couldn't take the chance that it wasn't one of the 20% that happened to be working. There's also an extraordinary parallelism between the Ceausescu regime and this novel. Well, two parallelisms actually. One is the endless production of works by the great leader. Ceausescu's collected volumes ran to 15, to 20, to 30 volumes. Of course, he never wrote a word of it. They were all written for him by communist scribes and apparatchiks. Hodja in Albania had a similarly unread Calvinist library that was produced for him by tame scholars who had been shot or tortured to death or their families killed and their family owned bulldogs so that they'd never existed, hadn't they actually produced this sort of material. The other parallelism is the pyramids. In this novel, the party builds four enormous ministries. Ministry of Peace, which is for war. The Ministry of Love, which is for torture and oppression of the citizen into the purity of Insof, the ideology of the dictatorship, which is called the Ministry of Love because it's the inversion of that. Then there's other ministries. Ministry of Plenty, which deals with economic affairs, usually involving endless brain statistical announcements of pig iron production, which all of it was a hilarious joke from Eastern Bloc dictatorships, but actually came quite close to the truth. Now, in Romania, Ceausescu ordered large pyramids to be built in the capital. And these were built and were observable when the regime fell in a coup organised by ex-communists and other factors to form what was called the National Salvation Front at that time. Do you remember the scenes on television? When Ceausescu's on the podium, surrounded by the Securitate, many of whom were orphans. Many of them were taken from orphanages directly by the Ceausescu family and impregnated with the idea that they were related to him, that Ceausescu and his ubiquitous wife, who was always with him on all occasions, were their mother and father. That's one of the reasons psychologically why the Securitate government fought to the end, unlike many of the other Eastern Bloc dictatorship servants who gave up when the going got rather rough. There's that incredible moment which is history as it's observed, when Ceausescu's orating about the dangers of fascism, the dangers of revanchism, the dangers of counter-terrorism, the dangers of a new bourgeois elite arriving in Romania, and he suddenly stops. And the Securitate around him start to get worried because the crowd is getting restive, and the crowd is working out that if just a few of them move, nothing will happen. But if they all move together, the security police don't know what to do. And there's a moment when Ceausescu's looking, do I step back from the microphone? Do I continue my anti-Western rant? Do I go into the helicopter with the Securitate? And he suddenly decides to go with the Securitate, and they disappear. And usually, if ever a regime's like that's in trouble, there's a music cut in the television and a ballet starts, you know, or something like that. That's always used to happen in the Soviet Union. Whenever somebody was being purged or there was something of moment going on, a famous feature film would appear, you know, just to fill the gap, just like Chipping the Colour, basically, in Soviet terms. It'd just be put up, you know. But the Romanian television just allowed it to run. And you could see the Ceausescu's running across the top of the roof, surrounded by Securitate who had their weapons out by then. And they got into the helicopter and went off, by which time the crowd, or mob, if you like, had broken into the bottom of the building and was coming up the building. And by then, the whole structure was swaying. Later that day, of course, the Securitate got on top of many of the buildings and started firing down on the people. And many of them were determined to bring back the regime. Now, this novel is interesting because it radicalizes certain elements of communist rule. One of the ideas that in some ways has got forgotten about in many treatments of the novel, and filmic and theatrical treatments like the Peter Cushing one and like the John Hurt one and that sort of thing, can't really deal with this. And this is the language the party creates, called INSOC. This is this all-purpose, jabbering, ideological Marxist-Leninist language, sometimes referred to as duck speak. Duck speak is the idea that you crack away, and your conscious brain is not really involved because your response to everything is a pre-formatted form of ideology. If you remember, one of the dictionary makers who befriends him, he's called Syme, in the grubby canteen where they all have their dinners, in the Ministry of Truth, which of course is to propagate lies on behalf of the regime and to rewrite the Times so that everyone is being purged, has the right place, and if somebody is purged, oh no, an unperson. You person in INSOC, Newspeak, and you have to go through the records and make sure that it's all filed so that there's no relationship with them, so that you can never be accused of thought criminality by virtue of the fact they exist. Every bit of spare paper that relates to an unperson, somebody done away with, you put in the memory hole, which goes down into the furnace, which is everywhere and ubiquitous behind these pipes, this little grill. Just like a sort of waste disposal, really. But the idea is it's waste disposal of all the lives who are being rewritten continuously so that the current reality fits in with the party view at any particular time. The party has two sections. The inner party, which wears black and has special privileges. The inner party can turn the telescreen off. Like that screen back there, every apartment, every room has a screen. But you can't turn it off, and it watches you as you watch it. So it's two-way. Yeah. And O'Brien, of course, in a famous scene in the second section of the book, can turn it off, because he's in the inner party. Most people, the TV, rather than at the end of the room, is in the centre of the room on a wall, so it can look down on there. And suddenly it can instruct you, citizen, you know, in appropriate behaviour. Everyone, like in Mao's China at the beginning of the day, in 1984, by Orwell, has to do physical jerks. You have to do physical exercises at the beginning of the day to coordinate yourself for the coming struggle and for the commitment to socialism, which will occur throughout all of the hours before you go back to bed again. Another interesting insight is the relationship that people have with their children. Orwell prefigures the world of bourgeois chaos where parents are frightened to discipline their own children, and which we increasingly see in liberal humanist societies. The parents are preyed upon by the young. One of the first and great scenes is with the Parsons family, who live just up the corridor in the block, because the Parsons boy is a terror. He accuses everyone of being, you're a thought criminal! He says, you're a nasty little vanguard against the proletariat elite! He screams that at everyone he meets. And he's got a pop gun. He says, you're going to burn, you're going to burn, you're going to the camps, you're going down the sulphide, blah! You know, and his mother is sort of terrified of him, because to discipline him is to engage in the possibility of a counter-revolutionary act. So he knows that he's got his parents where he wants them by this endless sort of young pioneers brigading sort of behaviour, you know? And it's a way of corralling the older generation into conformity. Orwell's instinct for particularly left totalitarian forms of power is very acute here, considering that except for a small period in Spain, he'd never really been subjected to them. The other thing, which is very interesting, and which Orwell knew extraordinarily well, partly because of his time at the BBC, was the penchant intellectuals have for propaganda. Intellectuals adore the idea that they're independent spirits who are highly individualistic and always love gainsaying what anyone else has said to them. In actual fact, all will believe that most intellectuals are craven and deeply conformist and extraordinarily group-oriented. And if you abstract the sort of politics, because he wrote BBC propaganda for India during the Second World War, and he wrote it in Senate House, which is in Malik Street, where the Central London University buildings are, this sort of whitewashed, slightly authoritarian, sort of 20s, 30s type, sort of heavy modern building. And there's a room 101 in that, because all of the BBC offices had numbers. And the torture scene with O'Brien was the same room from which he broadcast anti-Axis propaganda to India, where of course Gandhian pacifism and the Indian National Army that supported the Axis and so on were active. And the BBC needed people to beam propaganda over to that part of the world during the Second World War. Now, there's an individual in this book called Syme, who's an etymologist. He's writing the 11th dictionary of Ingsoc. And Syme meets Winston Smith in the grubby canteen. Remember the food they had? It's like sort of, your lunch will be a Brillo pad, which is sort of pork or something, you know, surrounded with a sort of bloody stew, surrounded by bits of decaying vegetable, all in a broth, and you sort of eat it down with Victory tea in a chipped mug. It's really hot because there's no milk in it, you know. And it's just sort of filth, really, but you just got to sling it down because it keeps you going. And all the time, Syme's talking about the 11th dictionary of Ingsoc. He says, oh yes, he says, we're going to totally eradicate intellectual freedom of thought. This is an intellectual. He said, we're going to so restrict methodologically the linguistic compass of the human so that people won't even be able to think independently of party rule, because to be able to think you have to have not just the concept but the language to express it. We will so restrict language to the possibility that the signifier can never go beyond that which is signified. There'll only be concrete concepts even for ideology, so that the mind works in a totally binary way, and you've filtered out the prospect of chaos and thought criminality before you've even uttered a word. And of course this is an intellectual who's devoted to the mind, but finds in his own imprisonment and self-torture a strange pleasure. Orwell's realised that there's a penchant in many intellectuals to weave the bamboo of their own cage in ever more fascinating shapes. And it's this extraordinary percipience in the way in which his own group behaves that gives the novel a particular power. Whether Syme's based on an academic called Syme, who wrote a famous book about Roman history in the 1930s, which was about the concept of Caesarism, I don't know. Or whether it's accidental. There are others, well, like Tillotson and various other party weavers and so on. There's a great moment of illumination as they're biting into one of these meat sort of burgers, you know? And yet, look around you, just over there, the masses in a society like this will be eating meat that isn't meat. Don't you know that when you go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, that many of the trays contain food that isn't food? A lot of junk food is gas, is chemicals, has no food at all. There was an American television program a couple of years ago where they, you know what Americans are like, a fifth of them are so obese, they could hardly fit through that door. I once saw a man in America who was so fat that I thought to myself, if you fired a bullet through his body, I had these thoughts, you know, if you fired a bullet through his body, you wouldn't hit a bone. Because he was so fat. And that's because he spent his entire life eating that sort of muck. But it's the same muck as the party apparatchiks eat and say that they like it in the canteen in the Ministry of Truth. And Syme is sort of spitting out this gristly non-meat as he's talking, you know. These are probably imagined dinners in the BBC, sort of refiltered to a novelist imagination. And he's going, yes, it's marvellous, Winston. He says, marvellous Ingsoc, no freedom at all. The individual will be completely restructured, a nerd. Imagine a baby with its limbs cut off, just quacking away ideologically. It's marvellous. He says, have another bit of chicken, you know. Because Syme is sold totally on the idea that his liberation is more and more enslavement, sort of anti-hermeneutically, to the minutiae of the party's lexicographical control of man. Now, to the non-intellectuals, to the mass of the population who are known as the proles, for whom the socialist revolution was created, of course, none of this matters at all. And Orwell is extraordinarily aware of the ultimate class split, which isn't really about poverty, but is about the mind. This split between people who live for and use the mind and those who are purely physical. One of the slogans of people who want change in 94 is the future is the proles. They look at the proles, and Orwell looks at them in a degraded way. One of the things that socialist and left critics such as Professor Raymond Williams have always said about 1984 and related books is that they are degrading to working class people, that they're the attitude of bourgeois snobs in their ivory towers, liberals really, cracking on about theory, condemning those who are struggling for a better world. Williams, who was a sort of communist fellow traveller or crypto-communist, from his birth at Oxford of course, for many years, deep down had this view of Orwell, and he expresses it in the Fontana Modern Masters about Orwell. Interestingly, Fontana gave the Lenin volume to Robert Conquest, which is an absolute hatchet job, and they gave the Orwell volume to Williams, which is a mild hatchet job because Orwell couldn't be criticised too much. Now, this desire for intellectuals to torment themselves and the division between them and those who are purely physical in this life is one of the cardinal themes in 1984. There's a moment when Winston, and Orwell partly identifies with Winston, although he's not an absolute fit, obviously, but he invests a certain emotional power that clearly comes from himself within the narrative into the Winston figure. There's a moment when he looks out, I think it's during a scene when he's about to have sex, you can't really say love, with Julia, his lover in the novel, and he looks out and he sees a proletarian washerwoman putting, with some pegs and sort of laundry on a line, and she sings a love song. It wasn't only an hopeless fantasy and all this, it's a musical, it's a vaudeville term. And Winston looks out at her and says, if there's any hope, it lies with the proles. Now, one of the most interesting features ideologically in 1984 is that the party creates its own dissent. The party creates its own past, it creates its own present, it creates its own future, because it controls the mind, the mental regime that people use to think about the present, the past, and the future. And it also creates its own dissent. All the dissenters use a book called The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein, who of course is Trotsky. And the 2-minute hate is oriented towards Trotsky. The 2-minute hate is very funny. In the ministry, all the chairs are lined up for the hate, and you get like a sort of a performance or giving a speech in a company office, There's a certain build-up of tension in the bureaucracy prior to the hate. And they all sit in these rows. And all of the blocks are at war with each other, because there's Oceania, there's Eurasia, there's East Asia. 3 great totalitarian socialist regimes dominate the world. Sort of North American Latino bloc, European bloc, Asiatic bloc, and they just divide here, Africa and the rest of it. They're not even mentioned, the Africans, poor old Africans, don't even get a mention. And initially the hate begins with millions of Eurasian troops, sort of the depiction of North Koreans or the Vietnam during those particular wars of American power, faceless, merciless Asiatic masses marching towards you, Tommy gun out, all depersonalised and impersonal. And then Trotsky's features will appear on the screen, and they all start hissing immediately. Women uncontrollable have sort of negative orgasms, they roll about, throw things at the screen, beast, beast, they scream. And the hate's beginning, you see, and the party officials are pointing out the Goldstein figure, because Goldstein wrote the book that defines the party's negation. But the inner trick is the party wrote that book. Because they control the mind even of their enemies. And there's an amazing scene with O'Brien in his ministry, where he's turned the TV instead, he's turned the screen off, so they can't be listened to, and he's dressed in black, and Julia and Winston, who he knows are lovers, dressed in denim, dressed in blue serge, are with him in the office. And they talk about Goldstein's book, and O'Brien says later on, I hardly wrote that book, of course. But no book's written by an individual, all books are written by committees, because the individual mind can never be trusted. So everything's done by committee. So they control, because that book is true. The party degrades itself, denigrates itself, tells you pretty explicitly what's going on and why, but never why they're doing it. So if you provide your opposition with the mental feed that they need in order to oppose you, you partly control them. And this is a very old idea, but in the 20th century, when mass propaganda became available for the manipulation of the masses, this was an extraordinary way of behaving. You actually create your own inversion so you can control them. Now, Trotsky, Goldstein, is a figure of the early party who provides the figure of the renegade. the running dog, the one who turns against the purity of the party's mission, and also the scapegoat, the goat that's actually tied with the rope to the tree. All the hatred, all the failures, all the espionage that goes wrong, every battle that's lost, it's the false, the Goldstein and the deviationists. They are the ones, they are the traitors in every word, behind every lie, behind every false sausage, behind every false statistic. The traitors lurk. Sin, secularized sin really, lurks everywhere, always to be purged in the hate, purged through self-criticism. Under communist regimes, individual party members had to undergo self-criticism on a regular basis. You'd be forced, self-criticism is expected, comrade, you'd be forced to stand up in front of the others and to engage in dialectical critique. I had moments of class evasiveness, I suffered from moments of false consciousness, I had certain religious moments where I denied the material nature of reality and the glory of the party's ascendancy, and everyone would be going, it's all very serious, you know. However, in certain regimes, this could be life and death. Many Polish people post-Gomulka, and after 1948, I went to a Catholic school, you did religion 4 periods a week. In those Catholics, ex-Catholic schools in Poland, you did Marxist-Leninism 4 periods a week. And you had to get those lessons right. It was very important. If you made a mistake about the 1844 Paris manuscripts in relation to Grundrisse, you were in error. And that was a serious matter. Western liberals smile cynically about all this because they've never really had to live under the pressure of those sorts of institutions and don't understand what it's like to have to play all those dialectical games and engulf yourself in all those sorts of lies. The irony is that, broadly speaking, working class children weren't exempt, but as long as they just prated a few simplistic slogans, it was all right. Because they were the ones for whom it was done. The party wanted to control the minds of people who can think, not those who in a sense follow and who are physical and who need an architecture within which to be. So the very modern totalitarianism understands that you have to control the mind first. You control the mind, you control the body, you control the present, you control the past, you dictate the future. The future is the party. The party has 3 slogans. War is peace. Ignorance is strength. Freedom is slavery. And those are on everything. They're on every beer mat. They're on every watch. They're on every sort of tablecloth. They're on every flag. War is peace. Ignorance is strength. Freedom is slavery. And then there's the ubiquitous Big Brother is watching you. And Stalin's heavy Georgian features, although some people say he was an Ossetian, but his heavy features, looking down on you, that sort of power, that sort of insistence, that sort of mask, because he was wearing a mask. There is an extraordinary picture of Stalin after Kirov's death. Kirov was the Leningrad party leader. He was assassinated in mysterious circumstances, and it puzzled lots of Western Marxists and liberals who didn't understand what's going on. And of course Kirov was killed on Stalin's orders to set off the purge, which sort of begins, if you exempt the Ukrainian famine, from the panoply of a politically oriented purge. What he did was Kirov was killed to provide an excuse for mass terror, less in the society than over the elite. Terror over the bureaucracy, terror over the army, terror over the KGB or one of its incarnations itself. Because Kirov was so high up in the regime that if he had been got to, it must be because of conspiratorial forces of an anti-revolutionary tendency at the heart of the Republic. This means that no one was safe, and that you look for the treason and the traitors right at the top, not at the bottom or in the middle. The mass shootings and killings and tortures beforehand that got rid of between 1/3 of a million and 1 million party members, higher to middling apparatchiks and members of the armed forces, and that decimated the Soviet higher command before Barbarossa, and were one of the many reasons, partly because their army was in the wrong position in relation to the invasion, because they were planning to attack Germany themselves and were caught unawares, and so on. But one of the many reasons for their collapse in the early days was because vast numbers of their officers had been purged, undergone self-criticism, failed the self-criticism down the plug. But of course, executioners and torturers and invigilators and those who interviewed those who were going to the camps or going to be shot, they themselves could be found guilty of deviation. Because if they made a mistake, or if they had an illusion of consciousness, They showed too much zeal in certain circumstances. If party ideology shifted slightly in a subsequent moment, they themselves could be before the committees. It's just like the French Revolution, but using sort of massed out technology in a way. And it's all quite deliberate. And there is this amazing moment when Stalin looks down on Kirov, this orthodox way where the body is laid out in the casket, and he looks down on Kirov, and it's a mafia boss looking at a subaltern that he's had killed in order to start a war between clans. And you can see it. I mean, it's just a subjective way of looking at reality, but you can see that Stalin knows in his face what he's done. And Stalin is this odd character that Western propaganda about Stalin has been based on Trotskyism for most of the 20th century. Stalin was actually an interesting and slightly creative man. He was also a brigand and an extreme criminal, addicted psychopathologically, very like Mao, to extremes of sadism and slaughter, which he positively enjoyed and gained pleasure from. Mao certainly had pronounced sadistic features and used to enjoy the physical torment of former party members who'd fallen out with him. Their bodies mutilated would often be exhibited in the streets in order to terrorise the masses into obedience with socialist logic. It's probably psychologically many Chinese have not recovered from this. The full extent of the terror that was represented in Asia by the Cultural Revolution is still not really explored even by quite radical and mainstream Western historiography. Certainly many people in Hong Kong saw enormous numbers of bodies floating out to them when Hong Kong was under British rule, of course. Many of these bodies were partly eaten as well. And many of them were Red Guards who started fighting with each other about moments of dialectical purity, because these bureaucracies have a tendency to start sort of ravening like dogs. They get so wild they start attacking themselves if there's no object to attack at a particular sort of time. This phenomenon also fed in through into many other things. The collapse of discipline that was also ordered, a sort of planned chaos, particularly in relation to the mass rape of German women at the end of the Second World War by Soviet troops, which even today President Putin says, Premier Putin says, never occurred. Never occurred. Western lies, fed by the enemies of Russia. Russia's a national country now, and Putin in many ways is a man to be admired in certain respects. But their old ways die hard in many ways. The interesting thing about those mass rapes, which certainly occurred, to the degree the German communists pleaded with the Soviets to stop them, because they were preventing the creation of Ulbricht's state in occupied East Germany. The reason they occurred was because commissars ordered them. And yet at the same time there was such a breakdown in order that order was itself part of the chaos with which it ramified. Stalin said, because all of Stalin's atrocities are ordered and are written down. The Katyn Forest massacre of the Polish officer corps, and there's an interesting quasi-revisionist Polish national film called Katyn, which is available now in certain art cinemas. It's not getting general release, but who in the multiplexes will see it, let's face it. But it is available through art cinemas, very gruesome at the end, very truthful at the end. Now, the whole Politburo ordered that. All of their signatures are on the death order, including Khrushchev's and the later Thorists and reformers. Stalin's name, bigger than all the others, graphologically, is at the bottom. Stalin. Because they thought they were going to win and the history was on their side, and all the records of the elite of the masses should be there for people to see, for history to judge. We had to wade through feces and blood and filth to create socialism and glory. Because heaven can come down onto the earth, but you've got to wade through the blood in order to get it. You know, heaven's coming down, but first, the abattoir. Onwards. And all were, in a sense, understood the logic of many of these processes, whereby purges and trials within regimes, within months, the men like Wyszynski in the 30s at the show trials, screaming at the victims, certain of their subordinates could be on the other side, being screamed at and be executed very quickly. Now, the interesting thing about this novel is that actually it's a man who, apart from in Spain for a few brief months before he got out, never really experienced the rigours of communism. There will be many leftists who say it's a fantasy, it's an artist's metaphorisation of what occurred in certain Eastern European societies, particularly certain societies that were less controlled by Soviet power, Hodges Albania, parts of Yugoslavia, and Ceausescu's Romania, where there were indigenous communist terrorist army-based and paramilitary movements came to power without necessarily the intervention of the Red Army. Sometimes you see purer forms of communism built to excess of a sort that occupied Eastern Europe didn't always equate to, because there were certain balancing elements in occupied Eastern Europe. In the Soviet Union, of course, Soviet power and pure communism had been completely uncontrolled. This is from the very beginning. The term Bolshevik Revolution is itself a misnomer. There was no revolution. It was a coup by the armed wing of the Bolshevik Party, and was thought of at the time by the people who did it. There was a moment when Trotsky, Lenin and Stalin slept together in a room about as big as this after they'd seized Kerensky's palace, and with newspaper on the ground. It was the first day after about being up for over 20 hours. And after they'd had a couple of hours sleep, Lenin got up and said, "Comrades, we've achieved a great thing. We've been in power for one day." Because power is what it's all about in relation to this ideology, which ramifies with what O'Brien says to Winston at the end. When Winston's, the point is that Winston has intellectually denied the sovereignty of the party's rule over the mind. Therefore, he's far more important than some troll who just rebels physically against the party, but then you break their arms or their legs or send them to a camp. That's of no importance. What matters is the mind that controls the body. So before they kill Winston, they will torture him into submission. He must love Big Brother before they execute him. He must be reworked. There's a famous moment, isn't there, when all his teeth are rotten. And O'Brien pulls all the teeth out, snap, in one go, and pulls them out of the mouth. And he says, "Look what you've done to yourself. Look how you've destroyed yourself." And Winston, John Hurt's always playing the victim, isn't he? And Hurt says, "You've done it to me, you've done it to me." And O'Brien says, No. You've done it to yourself by denying the love of the party. Do you remember that line? "You're just a cell, Winston," he says. "You're a cell." The individual has long ceased to exist in history as we define it. You are just an individual soul within the body of the party. Your death, your life is of no significance. You're just a cell. Do you die when you cut your fingernails? I say this in this theatrical manner because I played O'Brien. When I was 18, we had a school play. And it was quite interesting. There was a very bad actor called, who I won't name, whose surname was Smith. He played Winston Smith. And I played O'Brien, dressed all in black. And we didn't have any girls in the school. So we had the one homosexual in the sixth form dressed up as a girl who played Julia. And there's this strange moment, because this is an all-boys school, and all the Catholic brothers are down there. And it's all very odd, isn't it? I'm one of the few Protestants there. There's a transvestite on the stage and a bloke who can't act. And we're playing 1984. It's typical. And when Julia comes on, there's this great wolf whistle that then dies in its own throat. You know what I mean? When they all realise, good Lord, it's so-and-so dressed up. And there's a moment of horror and terror, which is all these grammar school boys. You know, they're all about 17, you know? And it's quite funny, actually. But O'Brien is one hell of a part. I mean, it really is, let's face it. Because he's attracted to O'Brien from the earliest stages, because O'Brien is a priest who believes in nothing but the ideology of the party and who is genuine. He's not a fraud. He wrote the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism. He believes in torturing Winston as a cog in the machine because it doesn't matter. You see, it's the futility of the absence of negation. They could just shoot Winston and have done with it. Why go through all these games? But the games are important because they prove the meaning of meaninglessness, if you like. That's the point. Because all of these ideologies are totally atheistic, totally anti-transcendental, totally mechanistic, and totally material. It's the sort of revenge of matter upon itself, if you like. It's the churning of matter. And he's the sort of the scientific non-priest of the churning of matter, human matter. There was a slogan of the Czechoslovak secret police where they used to say, "We are the engineers of human souls." And there's a famous Czech dissident novel called that, or uses it in the title. And that's how they really saw themselves. They saw themselves as a vanguard in history. The working class had been oppressed, had been degraded, had been decanted from the agricultural state, this is in classical Marxist theory, into the industrial one. The industrial civilization creates its negation. through social renewal and the creation of a vanguard which is drawn from all classes, particularly from bohemian, outsider intellectuals, half of whom are Jews, although they don't say that in the ideology, half of whom are Gentiles who want to destroy their own society because they hate it for various reasons and want to tear it down and want to see themselves, largely marginal figures hitherto, promoted to serious posts. This is why ideology is so important for these sorts of regimes, because it's committees and groups of quasi-intellectuals fighting with each other about meaning and purpose and plotting against each other and doing each other down and sort of releasing statements to the secret police so he'll be purged, so I can get his job, so I can edit this magazine, so I can overstep him and so on. It's a sort of the universalization with a ruthless and very violent terrorism added on of the struggles that go on in your average university department today. But that sort of engine of destruction isn't added on. All else extraordinary insight is his ability to see these processes at work. Many people, and don't forget, communism is one of the most extraordinary stories of modern man. Here is a movement that emerges with almost no social support at all and a few fringe ideologues around it in the middle of the 19th century. By the first third of the following century, just past, it controls vast stretches of the world. It kills tens of millions of human beings. It launches enormous wars. It creates enormous social structures. And then it fails virtually and deconstructs morally and structurally of itself, almost as if it no longer believes in its own lies anymore. It's quite clear that Gorbachev in many ways was a liberal or a social democrat in an old stroke new way, who allowed it to go. Because no reform of that system is possible unless you were to use violent and ferocious force, which Honecker wanted to do when the crowds began to come out in Germany prior to the deconstruction of the wall. Honecker's first instinct is to start on the streets, fire again, step on the bodies of those that are covered in blood and fire on them and step on their bodies. Socialism, imposed on the masses, because we are the masters of fate and history. And it's only because Gorbachev said the Red Army will not back the Stasi up in the streets that in a sense Honecker remembered he was feeling a bit ill and had a bit of cancer on the way, and so they allowed him to clear off to Chile. And slightly more reformist Euro-communist types took over, and eventually sections of the wall were opened. Remember those incredibly dramatic moments when the bulldozers and so on brought down sections of the wall and the Stasi and the Kapos came out and stood with their Kalashnikovs and the Germans came through the gaps that had been created and the Westerners were on the other side cheering and this sort of thing. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a British trade unionist leader who'd been called Ken Gill. He was leader of TAS, a certain section of the electrical engineering union. And he said that when the Soviet Union collapsed, a bloke with a broad Wiltshire accent, a genuinely working class communist, Gill said, a light went out for humanity when the Soviet Union went down. A light went out, and he died soon after. Because you see, for people like him, it was a secret religion. And it was a belief in a radiant future, as they used to call it in the ideology, a radiant future for the Nazis. You know, and there was a belief in it. It's why all these people spied and so on. Of course, many of them did it because they had money, they were perverts, they were rebels against their own system. But never forget that many of them converted to it, like a quasi-religious conversion. Maclean, who was part of the Filby Ring at Cambridge, read an incredibly boring book called Materialism and Empirico-Criticism by Lenin, which is based upon the materialism of a scientist at the beginning of the 20th century called Mach. And the light came into his eyes. Now history is clear to me. There is a plan. There is progress from the agricultural to the industrial stage through the dialectical reversal via the vanguard that creates socialism that is above the masses, and eventually all the apparatus that's needed to install this, the terror, the lies, the propaganda, the secret police, the endless purging, the mass graves, will all fade away. All fade away and be replaced by love and by the encomium of forgiveness, as all members in all classes embrace each other and there's no division. There's no division of race, of kind, of class, of gender, of ideology. All are one. All are one in the radiant future. And that's socialism, you see. And there's a stage even beyond socialism, communism. Because if you listen to the communist parties when they're in power, they will say that socialism is just an approximation to that which exists beyond them. Another quasi-religious idea, really a quasi-idealistic conception, whereby the perfection of the future is still to be announced. And in that moment, the state itself will wither away. There'll be no secret policemen that start kissing their rubber truncheons and this sort of thing and throwing them away. It's all going to die before the dispensation of love and that sort of thing. But down in the abattoir, comrades have got some dirty work to do in the name of progress. And it is, if you look at it, it is an enormous sort of materialist Greek tragedy acted out over about a century and a half. Because it affected and changed the whole nature of the world, this ideology. China, of course, has done a reverse trick. They've kept an authoritarian, technocratic regime that's frozen the ideology like a theology it no longer even listens to, and has introduced the most aggressive form of capitalism on earth, using the very structures of authoritarian rule that were supposed to bring in its opposite. So there's a strange hybrid, and you have these sort of dinosaur states like North Korea, which strongly resembles in the cult of the emperor, stroke the Kim Il-sung figure who's worshipped like a god. Didn't you know he discovered the light bulb? Didn't you know he wrote all the books in the British Library? Didn't you know he painted personally the roof of the Sistine Chapel? Didn't you know that virtually every scientific development has been done by Kim Il-sung and his semi-dead son and that sort of thing? Because most North Koreans are taught this all the time. There are also very interesting elements in the fugitiveness of communist ideology, where you do wonder whether it's a materialist belief system at all. In camps in North Korea, if a dissident has a child, a woman, often the child will be killed by a commissar. The child will be born, the child will be presented as the child of a deviant and of a thought criminal. This is the doctrine of hereditarianism, isn't it? This is the doctrine that the child inherits the social and secular sins of the parent. This isn't a left-wing idea at all, essentially, so it's very odd, mentally, and the commissar will step on its neck and crack it, break it in front of the camp. Death of a deviant, alien to socialism and the practices of the masses. I do not this is a crime. I kill not a human, I kill an enemy of the human. When Yugoslav trials killed a large number of people in 1945-46, trials in inverted commas, they were described not as trials of people, but as enemies of the people. The communist jurist would get up in the dock and say, you are an enemy of the people. And you knew what that meant, not long to go. Let's hope it's over quick. I mean, that's what people really thought when they were subjected to this. What this novel does is it draws out the psychological, linguistic and mental processes of what's going on in those quicker sort of enemy of the people type trials, which of course Ceausescu and his tribe got at the end. There is an knock-off principle, isn't there? What goes around comes around, as hippies in the 60s used to say. And I remember when Ceausescu and his wife were tried, the trial lasted for 3 hours. There wasn't much of a defence, just about jabbering a bit, pushed to her side by a military policeman. They were dragged out of the court and shot as terrorists by the National Salvation Front, 2/3 of whom were ex-communists. And remember there's that moment when the camera goes towards them as they're lying on the ground and the camera flicks onto the faces. The BBC, ITV and CNN, if CNN existed then, cut that because it was too distressing for Western audiences. Too distressing for Western audiences. But you could see the blood on the ground, and they were dead. So they got the trial that they gave many others. And the Securitate, their bastard children, ideologically as well as structurally, fought to the end and died in burning buildings to keep it going. Hodges Albania was an even more extreme example even of that. You could be arrested in Hodges Albania for owning an orange. Because it had obviously couldn't been grown there, and you'd imported something from the regimes of the class enemy. So, you were even a criminal for owning a bit of fruit. And that's why, in a very, if you view it in a cross-conscious European way, a very scandalous way, many European politicians from the comfortable West, like Poland, so on. Do you remember he went to East Berlin waving bananas? Waving great bunches of fruit, saying, you haven't seen this, have you? You poor little people, you haven't seen this stuff for 50 years, Extraordinarily condescending, But the liberal materialism was at a much higher level. That's one of the reasons why it collapsed further east. But the interesting thing is that communism is really the product of intellectuals. In some ways it's a sort of revenge of intellectuals as a class upon life. The interesting thing is that some of the softest elements of Western societies, some of the most gone-in-the-tooth elements, also some of the most economically comfortable elements, at the start are the people who pushed the Western and Eastern version of these ideas when they came to power. There's a famous story of Jean Cocteau, which may well be apocryphal, the French artist and poet and writer and film director and all the rest of it. And he's in this, it's about 1910, and Lenin was certainly around then in Parisian salons, as were many other people. Don't forget Stalin was in Vienna. There are rumours that Hitler, Stalin and Lenin once sat in a street in Vienna in different cafes and they didn't know the other from the other, all developing their thinking. And you never know, because many of these bohemian undercurrents mix with each other in that decade of proto-revolution between 1900 and 1910, revolving around the Soviet proto-revolution of 1906, the early Soviet attempt at revolutionism. I personally think in a totally differentiated way we're in a similar era now. We're on the threshold of enormous changes, of Herculean changes, the nature of which we don't really understand yet. And I think very like the first decade of the last century, we're looking out on what's coming. Because quite clearly an attack upon Iran is prefigured by much of the rhetoric that's going on now, and much of which is being prepared now. They say they can't weaponize it by 2014, but who knows? So the interesting thing is the support of the wealthy and the intellectual outsider for a belief system that materially offered them very little, but intellectually offered them power. Power. Winston says at the end, what's it all about to O'Brien? What's all the hunger and the torture and the endless war and the propaganda and torturing me to death for a cause I don't really believe in, to say I love Big Brother and then I do and then you shoot me? What's it all for? And O'Brien says, it's for power. Power, he said. Power and more power. Power as a dialectical principle. Remember that great line? If you want the future of the human race, Winston, imagine a boot. A boot. Stamping on a human face forever. And it's a sort of satire of a sort of egomaniacal intellectual power, using ideology purely as a vehicle. And there's very interesting insight into communism there. At the end, Mao lived like a potentate. He lived like an ancient Persian or Egyptian emperor. He was surrounded by women. He was surrounded by bastard children that he created. The Politburo used to meet around his bed. Mao, who was quite a beast towards the end, and used to say, I pardon for all women here, but he used to say to Western correspondents, he cleaned himself in his women. This is the great champion of humanity, the great anti-sexist, you see. This is what they're like when they're in power. Surrounded by Marxist books. Have you ever seen pictures of his bedroom? This enormous bed, like that of an emperor, with all these women and children around, and the secret police in their caps with the red star further back. And then these volumes of Marxist prose behind the red books, his own work allegedly, to the front. And then he'd be lying on this bed, dictating to the others like a sort of overgrown child, like an ideological version of a mad Roman emperor, essentially, because that's how it ended up. And probably the ideology had sort of ceased to matter by then, hadn't it? It became a sort of mental chess that you play with yourself and with others for reasons of pure power. Because these economies weren't making anything except more weapons. And the idea of Marxist critique of capitalism, that the proletariat is degraded because of the distinction between price and value, and that the surplus product is ripped out of the proletariat and invested by capitalists abroad in empire. When Lenin wrote Imperialism in 1916, this is why he explained the revolution hadn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet because they've displaced the capital they've stolen from the people, stolen from the proletariat. And the irony was that extreme communism was an extreme version of what Marxism had criticised Western societies for. Total degradation of the peasantry and proletariat, total ripping out of surplus value, used to create more and more weapons in order to build more and more forms of power, pure power, as an end in itself, but always at a material level, because the ideology could only justify itself in material terms. I think, to close, the interesting thing about 1984 is that what lingers in my mind is the sense data. When Winston's in the Ministry of Truth and he needs to use the intercom, he has to clean the holes in the device because they're full of dirt, you know? It's that grubby, dirt under the fingernails element. that you get in state socialism, even in Western societies. Anyone who's ever queued in the DHSS queue, the glass in the office is cracked. There are no plants. There's no carpet. Everything's unnaturally cold and grubby. You know, your substandard NHS ward, you know what I mean? Everything's slightly out of focus. No one listens to you when half of them are foreign anyway. No one really listens to you when you say something to them. You exist, they exist for you, don't they? Not the other way round. There's a sort of, this logic, the state socialist logic, the logic of the producer, writ large. You couldn't buy anything in shops in the Soviet Union at the end, but the party could. You had a card and you went to a special shop where you could get razor blades and you could get boots, you could get just the niceties, soap, the things you needed to live, basically, you know, in any sort of an industrial society. And the masses would queue. Anthony Burgess, who wrote Clockwork Orange, once went to a restaurant in Moscow and you sat there for 5 hours. There's a bit of service now, and screw you, we're the staff. You'll wait there for 5 hours, and then after 5 1/4 hours you get this sort of cabbage soup, which is just a bit of cabbage and a bit of hot water with a sprig of parsley in it. It's sort of chucked at you, you know. It's like Western restaurants now, isn't it? But it's that sort of idea of the grubbiness of its texture, when you've got this ideology of idealism and universal brotherhood, and yet you return to the cabbage soup and the smell and the dysfunctional lift and the hair floating in your soup. And you know that state socialism of that sort, imposed by a party bureaucracy and army, has gone, and in all probability won't come back. And yet the real point of 1984, and the reason why this novel lives, and still probably frightens people in a way, is the ubiquity of its concern with mental processes, and the belief that when humans, in many ways, reject the philosophies of the past, they will try and subordinate the present to them. Communism has died, maybe killed 100 million in the 20th century, or more, and had to be fought. The tendency of which we're in some ways a part is accused by many out there of beastliness and of non-humanism and all the rest of it. But I would say that there was a time when the forces of the right had to be as ferocious, had to be almost as nasty as what they were attacking, and was attacking them. Otherwise they would have been completely destroyed by it. This was an ideology that preached utopia, but believed that the ends justified the means in a manner that's beyond that of a mafia don. Do you remember the scene in Mario Puzo's The Godfather, where the Jewish Hollywood producer is a paedophile, and the Irish-German consigliere, the counsellor of the mafia clan, and they talk about him, and he's racially abusive to people of Italian and Germanic and Irish ancestry and all the rest of it, and the Don waves that away, he's not blocked with all that. And Brando, a bit thinner then, a bit of a better actor then, said, he said, what does this man love? And he loves a horse. So the mob cuts off the head of the horse and puts it in his bed. Why? Because the Don is saying, I am a man beyond all law, beyond all morality, beyond anything you could even think of. I can strike at you in a way you don't even understand, because I have no limits. No limits. And there was a time when communism, before it froze into a bureaucracy, had no limits at all. I'll close with Lenin's remark. Don't forget the Cheka, the secret police, was created momentarily. It was said it would be dissolved in a few years, like the terror under Robespierre. It's just to impose discipline upon the class enemies so paradise can begin. Towards his death in 1924, Lenin's brain was liquefied. Many medical historians believe that at least half of it was liquid. And at the height of the terror and the war between the red and the whites, which of course the whites lost, Lenin said to one of his aides, now is the time. There's maximum chaos, total starvation, the complete collapse of the Russian economy, and civil war. Now is the time. And the aide said, time for what? And he said, time to seize all the assets of the Orthodox Church. Time to seize all their churches. Time to turn them into granaries and barns and shops and places where we put tank parts and tractors. And the aide said, why? And Lenin said, why not? Why not? We are history. We do what we wish. But he believed that in the moment of chaos, you extirpate the meaning of the prior order that the chaos is destroying, because they always worked on the mind before they worked on the body. Thank you very much.
An important book on this thing in the 1950s, The Goblet Failed.
Yes.
You read it?
Yes, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yes, Don.
That's all well with a problem for this society. Could it be interpreted that is 1984 as an interpretation of this class act looking at society and its dictatorship? This is not a democracy, and we're doing state in the 21st century. We are saying God save royalty, we're a democracy.
That's our on Labour's rule in 48.